Dear learners, good day. In this module, we will be discussing the role, functions and responsibilities of the state legislature, which by and large is unicameral in nature but is sometimes bicameral also. First things first, we will take up the introduction of the concept of a state legislature. Under Article 162 to 212 of the Constitution, we have provisions pertaining to the state legislature. These provisions deal with the organization, composition, duration, officers, procedure, privileges and powers of the state legislature, apart from various other provisions. It is important to note that the concept of state legislature and its pattern and its establishment varies across states of the nation, and there is no uniformity in the organization of state legislatures. State legislatures, as we've already discussed, may be either unicameral or bicameral. Unlike the Union Parliament, which is essentially bicameral in nature, certain states have a unicameral legislature with a single legislative body, while certain others have a bicameral legislature with two legislative bodies. So we have to understand that the Parliament is empowered to create or abolish the legislative councils at the state level, which is the equivalent of the Rajya Sabha at the state level, based upon the resolution passed by the Legislative Assembly of the state concerned. Such a resolution by the State Legislative Assembly is expected to be passed with a 2/3 majority, and on this 2/3 majority, the Union Parliament can proceed to either create or abolish the state legislative councils. Moving on to those states which are bicameral in nature, in India there are several states which are bicameral in nature, which include Andhra Pradesh, Maharashtra, Uttar Pradesh, Telangana, Bihar and Karnataka. So these are the only states in India that have a bicameral legislature comprising of two houses at the state level. Apart from this, all of the states of India have a unicameral legislature with a single body serving as the Legislative Assembly. You have to understand the notion that this concept of bicameralism as such was debated, discussed and critiqued in the Constituent Assembly of India, and it was decided against a broader notion that it would be appropriate to have a unicameral system at the state level rather than have a bicameral system, particularly in view of the fact that having a bicameral system, which the Constituent Assembly of India thought would delay the decision making process, and having a bicameral system at all the states, cutting across all the states, would result in expenses which are unwarranted. So that being the reason, it was given that the Parliament would be empowered to create or abolish state legislative council on a need basis. So specific states, particularly in view of their peculiar political circumstances, their size and population, have decided to adopt a bicameral system of state legislative assemblies and state legislative councils, while others have continued to remain unicameral with a single state legislative assembly. So now proceeding ahead, we will be discussing the composition of the state legislative assembly, followed by the composition and election of the state legislative council. The Constitution provides that the state legislative assembly, which is the lower house if it is bicameral in nature, in that case the state legislative assembly, and generally speaking the members of the state legislative assembly, that is the MLAs, they are elected directly by the people based on universal adult franchise. So the elections to the MLAs are similar to elections to the Lok Sabha. According to the Constitution, there is a minimum and maximum limit that is provided for. A broad range of minimum and maximum numbers that are provided for under the Constitution, which is fixed as 60 being the minimum for the MLAs count and the 500 being the maximum. So across the various states of the nation, the legislative assemblies will have inevitably a strength ranging from 60 to 500. However, there are certain specific exceptions to this principle. The case in point being certain small minor states of India, including the northeastern states. These include Arunachal Pradesh, Sikkim, and Goa, where the minimum number is not fixed as 60 but rather 30. And in the case of Mizoram and Nagaland, the strength is fixed as 40 and 46 respectively. So proceeding ahead, how is the election for the state legislative assemblies conducted? We can see that it is through a system of direct elections by universal adult franchise, which is carried out by the division of the entire state into what we call as territorial constituencies. So these territorial constituencies are demarcated, are allocated in a manner such that there is equivalence, there is parity between the population of a particular state and the number of constituencies that exist therein. So the understanding behind this notion is that the ratio between the population of each constituencies and the number of seats allotted to it should be equivalent throughout the state. It is to ensure that no particular constituency is overcrowded with a population higher than necessary, and at the same time to prevent constituencies which are very less populated at the same time. So the underlying notion is it should be equally spread out throughout the constituencies based upon the population. Proceeding ahead, we can see that when we speak of the constitutional framework, even for the state legislative assemblies, the constitution envisages a system of reservation for both the scheduled castes and the scheduled tribes for the assemblies at the state level based upon the population of a particular area. So depending upon the population of scheduled castes and scheduled tribes within the overall population of that particular state, the amount of seats that are reserved for the scheduled castes and scheduled tribes are decided accordingly. Moving ahead, we will be discussing the composition of the state legislative councils. We can see that the state legislative council, unlike the state legislative assembly, is indirectly elected. So they are indirectly elected, and just like the state legislative assemblies, the state legislative councils also have a maximum and minimum strength. The maximum strength is linked to the strength of the legislative assembly of the state concerned. So the maximum ceiling limit of the legislative council is pegged at, or it's limited to 1/3 of the total strength of the legislative assembly of that state. So what it means is that the size of the legislative council of a particular state is dependent upon the size of the legislative assembly of that particular state. However, there is a minimum strength that is envisaged, which provides that the legislative council size at a minimum shall be 40 in number. So what we can see is that depending upon the population of the state, which ultimately determines the size of the legislative assembly of the state, case in point being the state of Uttar Pradesh, which owing to its huge population has a significant size of legislative assembly. So that will have a bearing, that will have an impact upon the size of the legislative council in the state. So the objective behind this linkage between the size of the legislative assembly to the size of the legislative council, and generally keeping or limiting the legislative council at a strength which is lower than the legislative assembly, it is to ensure the predominance of the legislative assembly. The state legislative assemblies are expected to play a dominant role, and they have an upper hand in order to ensure that this system is envisaged. So moving ahead, we have discussed the functioning and the composition of the state legislative councils. We will be discussing now as to the composition and the manner in which members of the state legislative councils are elected. As we've already discussed, the election for the process of the state legislative council happens through what we call as a system of indirect elections, and 1/3 of the total population or the strength of the state legislative council is elected by the members of the local bodies in the states like municipalities, district boards, etc. So representation is given for the members of the local bodies to decide who is going to become a part of the legislative council, and 1/12 of the total strength of the state legislative council is elected by graduates of 3 years standing and residing within the state. So this is known as graduate constituencies, wherein the electorate comprises of graduates who will be deciding or who will be electing the members of the state legislative council. After this, we have 1/12 of the total membership being elected by teachers of 3 years standing in the state who teach not lower than the standards of the secondary school. So secondary school teachers, they get to elect a portion of the state legislative councils as per this aspect known as teachers constituencies to the state legislative council. Following that, we have the role of the state legislative assembly itself, that is the lower house in the state, which is directly elected by the people. They get to choose 1/3 of the members of the state legislative council if it exists in that particular state. And last but not the least, the remainder is given by way of nomination to the governor, who chooses members or persons who have special knowledge and practical experience in various fields such as literature, science, art, cooperative movement and social service to become nominated to the state legislative councils. So thus we can see that 5/6 of the total membership of the legislative council is indirectly elected through special electorates that range from members of local bodies, legislative councils, legislative assemblies, graduates, teachers and so on and so forth, while 1/6 of the total membership is nominated by the governor of the state. So this is the manner in which the composition of the state legislative council is decided. So moving ahead, this entire process of elections to the state legislative council is carried out through what we call as a system of proportional representation by means of a single transferable vote. So this is akin to the system of elections for the President of India, which also follows a system of proportional representation with single transferable vote. The same pattern is emulated for the state legislative councils as well as the membership of the Rajya Sabha as well. So moving ahead, the duration. What is the tenure of the state legislative assembly and how different is it from the state legislative council? So we can draw parallels between the state legislative assembly and the Lok Sabha, and the state legislative assembly, just like the Lok Sabha, is not a continuing chamber. It has a fixed duration which is normally of 5 years from the date of its first meeting after the general elections. However, there is a scope for premature dissolution in certain circumstances. Upon the expiry of this 5-year period, automatically the house, which is the state legislative assembly, it stands dissolved, and in certain cases the governor of the state is authorized to prematurely dissolve the assembly at certain times in order to pave the way for fresh elections. Nevertheless, there is a mechanism for the extension of the lifetime of a state legislative assembly, particularly in the context of a national emergency. When the Parliament of India has declared a national emergency, it may also choose to extend the lifetime of a state legislative assembly for durations up to 1 year at a time. So they can get an extension on a 1 year basis. and there is no maximum ceiling limit for this, but this can happen only so long as the national emergency is in operation and not beyond that. The constitution says that in no circumstance can such a state legislative assembly whose lifetime has been extended on account of national emergency continue to operate or continue to function beyond a period of 6 months after the stoppage or the cessation of the emergency. So this is an extraordinary measure which enables the parliament to extend the lifetime of the state legislative assembly on a one year basis in view of national emergency, and the moment national emergency is ended within 6 months it is expected to cease as well. So this is the broad understanding of the notion of duration of the state legislative assembly. Moving ahead, what is the duration of the state legislative councils? As we have already discussed, we may draw parallels between the Rajya Sabha, which is the upper house, also known as the House of Elders, to the state legislative councils in those states which are bicameral in nature. So the state legislative councils is a continuing chamber. It has no concept of dissolution and it is a permanent body. Though the body is permanent, the members enter and exit based upon a principle of formula which we call as the rule of 1/3, that is 1/3 of the members on a biennial basis, that is every 2 years 1/3 of the total members of the state legislative councils they retire. So in toto we can see that a single member who is nominated to the state legislative council, he enjoys a tenure for a maximum of 6 years, but he is eligible for re-election without any upper ceiling limit. So frequently on every 2-year basis there is a change in a portion, that is 1/3 of the membership of the state legislative council undergoes a change, and what it entails is that in no particular circumstance or in no case will the membership of the state legislative council be empty. That is the essence of the notion of the state legislative council as a permanent body. So apart from this, whenever there is a vacancy, it is filled up by fresh elections, and in certain cases by nomination by the governor at the beginning of every 3rd year. So proceeding ahead, we can see that the notion of retiring members being eligible for re-election and re-nomination any number of times. So there is no ceiling limit on the members of the state legislative council from continuing in office by re-election or re-nomination. Moving ahead, what is the qualification to hold a post as a member of the state legislature? It may be either as a member of the state legislative assembly or as a member of the state legislative council. So the first and foremost requirement that we have to have in mind for a person to be eligible to contest or to be chosen as a member of the state legislature is that he must be a citizen of India. Apart from being a citizen of India, he must also make and subscribe to an oath or affirmation before the person authorized by the Election Commission for this purpose. So these two conditions, if he is a citizen of India and he makes or subscribes to an oath as specified by the Election Commission, then he will be eligible to be chosen as a member of the state legislature. So what does this oath or affirmation consist of? In this oath or affirmation, he or she swears that they will be bearing true faith and allegiance to the Constitution of India, as well as to uphold the sovereignty and integrity of India. These are the contents of the oath or affirmation that is expected to be taken by a person who intends to become a member of the state legislature. And last but not the least, there is an age requirement, an age criteria that is specified for the purposes of appointment or election as a member of the state legislative assembly as well as the state legislative councils. So a person who intends to become or contest for the elections as a member of the state legislative council, he should have completed at least 30 years of age, and a person who intends to become chosen as a member of the legislative assembly, that is an MLA, he has to have completed at least 25 years of age. So depending upon whether a person intends to become an MLC or an MLA, the age criteria of 30 years and 25 years are fixed as a minimum mandatory requirement. And apart from that, the law, the constitution insists that a person who intends to become a member of the state legislature must also possess other qualifications as may be specified by the parliament. So the parliament is empowered to make any other additional qualification requirements over and above these constitutionally specified qualification requirements for the eligibility for the state legislature. So broadly we can see that this eligibility criterion is provided for additionally under the Representation of Peoples Act of 1951, which says a person to be elected to the Legislative Council must be an elector for an assembly constituency in the concerned state, and to be qualified for the governor's nomination he must be a resident in the concerned state. So in respect of legislative council, if you intend to stand for elections of the legislative council, you should be an elector, meaning that you should be a voter in a constituency within that particular state concerned. And if you are going to be nominated by the governor, you should be a resident of that particular state, which is a requirement. So the requirement of being a voter or alternatively being a resident is mandatory for membership for the legislative council, depending on whether you are getting into the legislative council through election route or through nomination route. So moving ahead, the other requirement is that a person to be elected to the legislative assembly must be an elector for an assembly constituency in the concerned state. So what it means is that suppose I intend to contest in elections as an MLA in the state of Tamil Nadu, I should have my right to vote in any of the constituencies within the state of Tamil Nadu. So that is the broader understanding of the notion of the Representation of Peoples Act 1951. The last requirement is that if a person is a member or he intends to contest in elections in seats that are exclusively reserved for the scheduled castes and the scheduled tribes, then it is mandatory that he be a member in reality of that community. If it is a scheduled caste reserved seat or constituency, only a member of the scheduled caste community would be eligible to contest. Same is the case for a seat that is reserved for the scheduled tribes. However, a person who is a member of the scheduled caste or scheduled tribe, he is eligible, he is permitted to contest in any other unreserved constituency as well. So that is the point to be remembered when we look at the Representation of Peoples Act of 1951 and its requirements pertaining to contesting in the state legislative assembly or council elections. So moving ahead, what is the disqualification for the state legislature? So what are the prohibitions, what are the embargoes, what are the no-goes when we speak of the position of the state legislature? Under the constitution, we can see that a person is disqualified from being chosen as and for being a member of the legislative assembly or council in a state. Number one, if he holds any office of profit under the union or under the state government, with an exception to that of a minister or any other exempted office by the state legislature. So the first prohibition, the first disqualification is that of office of profit, in which case a person would be disqualified from holding a post as an MLA or an MLC. Moving ahead, the next important disqualification is unsoundness of mind. A person of unsound mind, if he is so declared by a court of competent jurisdiction, he would be disqualified from contesting or from holding the post of an MLA or an MLC. Number 3 is a person who is an undischarged insolvent. A person who is an undischarged insolvent is also ineligible, disqualified from elections for the state legislature. And number 4, if a person is not a citizen of India or he has voluntarily acquired a foreign citizenship or is under any acknowledgement of allegiance to a foreign state. In all of these circumstances, we can see that a person would be ineligible, he would be disqualified from holding a post or an office in the state legislature. And last but not the least, he is otherwise disqualified by any other law that the parliament may have made. So specifically, just like how additional qualifications are mandated by the Representation of Peoples Act, additional disqualifications are also specified by the Representation of Peoples Act of 1951, which states that a person who is held guilty of certain electoral offences or corrupt practices in the backdrop of the election would be disqualified from holding a post of an MLA or an MLC. Number 2, any person who has been convicted of an offence with an imprisonment of 2 or more years, that would also amount as a disqualification. This is particularly in the context of the decision of the Supreme Court in Lily Thomas versus Union of India. Apart from that, we see that the failure to lodge election account expenses is also a ground for disqualification, and following which a person who has an interest in government contracts, works or services is also disqualified from contesting in elections for MLAs or MLCs. And the next aspect comes to directorship or being a managing agent or holding an office of profit in a corporation which with governmental stakes of more than 25% share. So what it means is that if you are a director or a managing agent or hold any other office of profit in an entity or a corporation wherein the government holds a share in excess of 25%, you are ineligible to contest in elections according to the Representation of Peoples Act of 1951. Apart from this, a person who has been dismissed from government service on the grounds of corruption or disloyalty, a person who has been convicted of the offence of promoting enmity between different groups or for the offence of bribery, and similarly a person who has been punished for preaching or propagating or practicing social crimes such as untouchability, dowry, sati, etc. under various specialized legislations, these people would also be disqualified from contesting in elections to the legislatures of the states. Moving ahead, apart from these disqualifications that are specified under the Representation of Peoples Act, the broader principle of anti-defection law, which is applicable for the Union Parliament, equally applies to the state legislatures as well. So the Constitution says that any person who is disqualified from being a member of the legislatures of the state on the ground of violation of the 10th schedule, on the ground of defection, such person will be disqualified as such. And we can clearly see that the Constitution has categorically said that the aspect of defection law or the violation of anti-defection law would be decided by the Speaker of the Legislative Assembly or the Chairman of the Legislative Council, as the case may be. However, there is a mechanism wherein after the decision in Quixote Holohan versus Zachelhu in the year 1992, the Supreme Court has said that it has the power to undertake judicial review of the decision that has been taken by the Speaker, subject to certain rules and regulations. So what it entails is that the decision of the chairman or the Speaker of the Legislative Council or the Legislative Assembly of the states is not full and final, and a person who is disqualified under anti-defection law can knock at the doors of the court, particularly the High Court and the Supreme Court, to decide the legality or the validity of such actions that have been taken by the Speaker or the Chairman, as the case may be. So proceeding ahead, we will be discussing, last but not the least, the aspect of vacation of seats. So in what circumstances will the seats of the state legislature be vacated by a member? So the constitution provides that the member of the state legislature vacates his seats in the following cases. Number one, in the case of double membership, when at any point in time a person who is elected as a member of both houses of the state legislature or simultaneously a member of the state legislature and the union parliament, either the Lok Sabha or the Rajya Sabha, in such cases he is expected to vacate one out of the two seats that he simultaneously holds in accordance with constitutional principles. So that, number one, leads to a vacation of the seat on the ground of double membership. Number two, on the ground of disqualification. As we've already discussed, there are several constitutional as well as statutory disqualifications for the post of MLAs and MLCs. If any person falls foul of those provisions, then he will be disqualified from office, which has the effect of vacating his seat. Number three, by way of resignation. So any person who is a member of the state legislature, either the legislative assembly or the council at the state level, is entitled to resign from office by writing to the chairperson or the speaker, as the case may be, depending on whether he is a member of the legislative council or the legislative assembly. And fourthly, there is the aspect of continuous absence, which has the effect of vacating the seats. So the constitution provides that a person who is a member of the state legislature or the legislative council, if he is absent for 60 days without the permission of the chair, the seat of that particular individual stands vacated. And last but not the least, there may be other extra constitutional or means over and above the constitution, wherein which a person's seats may be vacated. The first case is when the election of a particular candidate as a member of the state legislature has been held void by the court through an election petition. So when a person has been declared or adjudged the winner of an election, subsequently the legality of such a decision has been challenged before the court, and the court has finally decided the matter and has held the election of a particular candidate to be void. In such case also there is a vacation of the seat of a particular candidate or a particular member of the state legislature. The second circumstance would be expulsion from the house. So there is the power which is vested in the hands of the leader, or rather the speaker of the legislative assembly and the chairman of the legislative council, to expel the members of the house for misconduct or any other bad behavior. So in such circumstances, if as a form of disciplinary action, if a member of the legislative assembly or council is expelled permanently from the house, his seat stands vacated. And subsequently, whenever a person who is a member of the legislative assembly or the councils at the state is elected to a higher constitutional post, such as that of the president, the vice president, or he is appointed as a governor of a state, in all such circumstances, his seat as a member of the state legislature stands vacated. So these are the broad circumstances under which a person's seat stands vacated at the state legislature level. I hope through this module we have been able to get a broad idea of the composition, the duration, the function, and the broad qualifications and disqualification concerning the state legislature, comprising of the state legislative assemblies and the state legislative councils. Until we see you for the next module, thank you. Have a good day.